Alley and Parker wed in 1983 after meeting at a bar. She once recalled to People magazine, "I saw him and said to my roommate, for him, I would die."
There is a version of grief that nobody prepares you for, and it belongs to the people the world forgot to ask about. When Kirstie Alley died in December of 2022, tributes poured in from co-stars, from Hollywood legends, from fans who had grown up watching her steal every scene she was ever in. But one voice stayed almost completely quiet, and it belonged to the man who had once been closer to her than anyone else on earth. For 25 years, Parker Stevenson said almost nothing publicly about his marriage to Kirstie Alley, about their divorce, or about what she meant to him. Then, at 74 years old, in the days after her death, he finally wrote something. It was short. It was plain. And it may be the most honest thing either of them ever put into words about the life they once shared. To understand why a handful of sentences carried so much weight, you first have to understand what silence like that actually costs a person. Divorce is complicated enough between two private citizens. Divorce between two famous people, one of whom becomes a household name television star and the other of whom quietly steps back from the spotlight, is an entirely different animal. For a quarter century, Parker Stevenson watched his former wife's life play out in magazines, talk shows, and headlines. He watched her openly discuss falling in love with other men during their marriage. He watched her describe a co-star as the greatest love of her life while he was still raising their two children with her. And through all of it, he said almost nothing. Not out of bitterness, by every account, but because that was simply who he was. People who worked with him for decades describe him the same way, again and again, as someone who never needed to be the loudest person in the room to matter in it. So when the news broke that Kirstie Alley had died at 71 after a brief and largely private battle with colon cancer, the entertainment world reacted the way it always does. Tributes came quickly from people like John Travolta, who had co-starred with her in the Look Who's Talking films and who described their bond as one of the most meaningful relationships of his life. Ted Danson, her longtime Cheers co-star, shared a story about watching one of their old episodes on a plane just hours before learning she had died, reflecting on how she had made him laugh decades earlier and still had that same effect on him. Rhea Perlman spoke about the childhood sleepovers her own kids had at the Alley house, the elaborate treasure hunts Kirstie used to organize herself, and how there was simply nobody else quite like her. Every single one of those tributes was warm, specific, and clearly heartfelt. But none of the people writing them had shared a life with her the way Parker Stevenson had. None of them had built a family with her, fought with her, forgiven her, or watched her chase a career that eventually pulled them in two completely different directions. Parker's tribute, when it came, was posted to Instagram alongside an old photograph of the two of them from decades earlier. There was no lengthy reflection, no attempt to reframe their history, no effort to position himself as the grieving ex-husband deserving of public sympathy. He simply thanked her for their years together and for the two children, now grown with children of their own, that they had built a family around. He closed by saying she would be missed. That was essentially the entire message. No embellishment, no drama, nothing performative. And it is precisely because it was so restrained that it landed the way it did. Anyone who has ever tried to write something honest about a complicated relationship knows how hard it is to say only what needs to be said and nothing more. Parker Stevenson managed it in just a few lines, and in doing so, he told the world everything it needed to know about what she still meant to him without ever having to spell it out. A year later, speaking to a magazine reporter, Parker allowed himself to say a little more. He reflected on how difficult it was that Kirstie hadn't been around longer, particularly for their children, noting that no one is ever really ready to lose a parent and that it forces a kind of accelerated maturity onto the people left behind. What stands out about that comment, once you sit with it, is how little of it is about him. He didn't use the moment to talk about his own heartbreak or to revisit what the marriage had meant to him personally. He went straight to his kids, because from everything those who know him have said, fatherhood was always the role that suited him more naturally than anything he was ever cast in on screen or off. What most of the coverage around Kirstie Alley's death glossed over was just how sudden the whole thing actually was. According to her family and representatives, the cancer had only recently been discovered by the time she died, and reports at the time indicated it had already progressed to an advanced stage by the time doctors at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa were treating her. She spent her final period not in a hospital but at her home in Clearwater, Florida, surrounded by the people closest to her. Her diagnosis was only made public after her passing, which tells you something about how she chose to handle even the end of her own story. This was a woman who, throughout her entire life, insisted on controlling her own narrative, and that instinct apparently didn't change even in her final. Her children lost their mother. And Parker Stevenson, the reserved man who had once been the center of her entire orbit, lost something far more lead than either of those things, a woman he had loved deeply and ultimately failed to stay married to, whose differences from him had been the source of both the greatest joy and the deepest frustration of his adult life. To really understand why those few sentences carried so much emotional weight, you have to go back to the beginning, to a bar in Los Angeles in 1981, where a woman who had just survived the single hardest year of her life looked across a crowded room and decided she had found someone worth crossing it for. That year had already taken almost everything from Kirstie Alley before she ever met Parker Stevenson. In October of 1981, her parents were involved in a car accident near Wichita, Kansas, caused by a drunk driver. Her mother was killed. Her father was seriously injured. The timing of the tragedy overlapped almost unbearably with one of the biggest professional opportunities of her life, an audition for a role in the second Star Trek film. Rather than withdraw entirely, she reportedly asked that the production know her mother had died and her father was gravely injured, and that if they still wanted her, she would come in once she was able. The director waited, and she ultimately landed the part. It is a moment that captures something essential about who she was long before fame ever touched her, a woman who had already fought her way back from a serious drug addiction in her mid-20s, who leaned on her faith to help her recover, and who now had to bury her own mother while pushing forward professionally at the same time. She wasn't simply resilient. She was the kind of person forged by loss who refused to let anything else be taken from her without a fight. So when she walked into that bar and spotted Parker Stevenson sitting with another woman, and reportedly told a friend she would die for him, it wasn't some throwaway romantic line. It came from someone who had recently stared down real loss and understood exactly what it meant to want something and refused to let it slip away. She approached him. He was there with a date. By most accounts, he left that date behind to spend the evening with her instead. Parker Stevenson wasn't the person many assumed he was either. He grew up outside Philadelphia, the son of an investment banker and a working actress, and was educated first at a private prep school and later at Princeton, where he studied architecture and rode competitively. Acting was never part of the plan. He has said in interviews that he had no real interest in it at all and fully expected to pursue architecture instead. But roles found him anyway, first in a film in the early 1970s and then, more famously, as one half of the Hardy Boys television series alongside Sean Cassidy later that decade, which turned him into a teen idol almost overnight. When that show ended after a few seasons, he was left trying to figure out who he was once the noise died down. He has since described meeting Kirstie with a level of honesty that is hard to dismiss. At the time, he felt burned out and uncertain about where his career and his identity were headed. She, on the other hand, radiated a kind of conviction and joy about her own path that he felt he had lost. Being around her reminded him what that energy felt like. In other words, he was running on empty, and he found someone who still had a full tank. They dated for roughly 2 years before marrying in December of 1983. By then, they already understood how fundamentally different they were from one another. The real question was whether those differences would eventually pull them together or apart. As it turned out, over the course of their marriage, the answer was both. Parker once summed up their dynamic in a way that sounds almost like something out of a therapy session. He noted that they were essentially exact opposites, which made the relationship endlessly interesting, but also acknowledged that being opposites doesn't necessarily make for an easy marriage. And the contrasts really were significant. She was loud, expressive, and unafraid to fill any room she walked into, someone who could be simultaneously exhausting and magnetic to the people around her. He was quieter, more reserved, more comfortable staying out of the spotlight even while married to one of its brightest stars. They lived together in a sprawling home in Encino, California, where Kirstie reportedly kept dozens of animals at any given time, everything from dogs and cats to more exotic creatures. Ted Danson once described her during that era as something like a mix between a free spirit and an earth mother, which by most accounts was a pretty accurate read on her personality. Kirstie joined the cast of Cheers in 1987, taking over the role of Rebecca Howe, and went on to win both a Golden Globe and multiple Emmy Awards for the part. During one particularly memorable acceptance speech in the early 1990s, she thanked Parker in a way that generated laughter across the room and became something of a running joke throughout the rest of that award show. Parker later admitted that in the car afterward, he gently told her she never needed to mention him in a speech again, that he was completely fine skipping that particular kind of spotlight. That single exchange captures a lot about why the marriage was both genuinely loving and ultimately unsustainable. Kirstie lived her life turned all the way up. Parker lived his in the margins. For roughly 14 years, they found ways to meet somewhere in the middle, and that middle ground was real enough to produce genuine love and 2 children, but it was never quite enough to erase the underlying mismatch between them. In 1990, a few months into a pregnancy with what would have been their first biological child, Kirstie experienced a miscarriage. She wrote about the experience later with striking rawness, describing how her body continued producing milk for months afterward as if it hadn't processed the loss. She said she never fully got past it and later connected some of her long-term struggles with her weight back to that period of grief. Parker was there with her through it. 2 years later, the couple adopted their son, and their daughter followed in 1994. By most accounts, fatherhood ended up being the role that suited Parker more naturally than any part he ever played professionally. But even as their family grew, cracks in the marriage were widening. Kirstie would later admit, long after their divorce, to having fallen in love with actor Patrick Swayze while filming a project together in the late 1980s, at a time when both were married to other people. She was careful to clarify that nothing physical happened between them, but she also said she believed that kind of emotional entanglement was, in some ways, worse than an affair, because it put both marriages at risk without either person ever fully acting on it. She made a similar admission about John Travolta, her co-star in the Look Who's Talking franchise, describing him publicly as the great love of her life and saying it took years for her to stop thinking about him romantically. She insisted nothing physical ever happened there either, and said as much directly to entertainment reporters over the years, framing the issue not as infidelity but as a mismatch in what she and Parker ultimately wanted out of life. Parker never publicly disputed any of that. But it is worth pausing on what it must have felt like to be the quiet, private half of that marriage while his wife spoke openly, on television and in magazines, about being in love with other famous men. That is its own particular kind of isolation, one that doesn't require any actual betrayal to still feel deeply painful. Parker had his own version of quiet tension during this period as well. He joined the cast of Baywatch in the late 1980s and has acknowledged that his wife at the time wasn't thrilled about him spending his workdays at the beach surrounded by some of the most photographed women in television. He left the show after a single season, a decision he later described as one of the bigger career missteps of his life. By late 1996, after roughly 13 years of marriage, the couple separated. Their joint statement at the time expressed hope that they would remain close friends and committed co-parents. The second part of that promise held up. The first part took considerably longer. The divorce proceedings that followed were messier than the graceful separation their public statement had suggested. Custody and financial arrangements became contentious, and court documents later reported by entertainment press described friction over how the divorce was being mediated, including disagreements tied to Kirstie's deep involvement with the Church of Scientology, which had become an increasingly significant part of her life and reportedly complicated the negotiation process. The case eventually spilled into a jurisdictional dispute between two states with very different laws around marital property, which delayed resolution even further. The divorce was ultimately finalized in California in December of 1997, with the financial terms of the settlement wrapping up the following year. Roughly a year and a half after the divorce was finalized, Parker gave an interview that remains one of the more candid things either of them said publicly about the aftermath. He acknowledged that he and Kirstie weren't quite friends at that point, though they spoke regularly about their children, and admitted he genuinely didn't know whether that would eventually change. He also spoke about the religious weight the failed marriage carried for him personally, describing it in terms of vows made and ultimately broken, something he said he would always carry some regret over regardless of the reasons behind the split. Kirstie, for her part, matched that same honesty years later when asked directly why she never left Parker for someone else during the marriage, despite her admitted feelings for other men. She explained that she believed marriage required real effort, and that walking away wasn't something she considered an option simply because things had become difficult. 14 years, by that measure, wasn't a failure. It was two people who genuinely tried and ultimately still couldn't close the gap between who they fundamentally were as individuals. What kept Parker and Kirstie connected for the rest of her life wasn't nostalgia or unfinished business. It was their children. After the divorce, Parker went back to work, returned to Baywatch for a couple more seasons, moved into directing episodes of that show and others, and eventually spent several seasons on a Netflix series later in his career. He also found real happiness again personally, meeting his now wife in an almost accidental way, through a shared apartment building and, as the story goes, a borrowed soup pot. They married in 2018 at a vineyard in California. Kirstie's chapter after the divorce was, predictably, louder and more public. She had a brief engagement, went through a period of real self-reflection that she spoke about candidly in interviews, and went on to build an entire second act in entertainment, from a memorable weight loss campaign to a self-produced comedy series to 2 stints on a competitive dance show. She never stopped being one of the most talked about personalities in any room she entered. But the thread that tied the two of them together permanently was their children, William and Lily, both of whom grew into adults with lives of their own while staying close to both of their parents. Their son married young and had a son of his own in 2016, making Parker and Kirstie grandparents together for the first time. Their daughter later married as well and had a son in 2021, followed by a granddaughter born several months after Kirstie's death, a grandchild she never had the chance to meet. When Parker spoke about his adult children in that same later interview, there was an unmistakable mix of pride and quiet grief in how he described them, noting simply that his son had built a life around music and a small fishing business in Florida, while his daughter and her husband had gone into building handmade furniture together. These are not children living in the shadow of their parents' fame. They are people who build things with their hands and raise families of their own, carrying forward everything their parents gave them, including a complicated, imperfect, and very real kind of love that started in a bar back in 1981. There is a detail Parker mentioned once that keeps resurfacing when you sit with this whole story, the idea that meeting Kirstie brought back a sense of joy and direction he felt he had lost at a difficult point in his life. That isn't the kind of thing someone says about a person who was simply a chapter they moved past. That's the kind of thing you say about someone who helped pull you through a period you didn't fully realize you needed help getting through. That is what makes Parker's grief after Kirstie's death so different from everyone else's public tributes. Her co-stars lost a colleague and a friend. Her fans lost a beloved television presence. Parker lost the woman who had reintroduced something essential in him during a stretch of his life when he was uncertain and directionless. She had walked toward him with the certainty of someone who had already survived the worst year of her life and understood, in a way most people never fully grasp, that life is too short to wait around for permission to want something. And in return, he gave her 14 years of genuine effort, 2 children who grew into remarkable adults, and, decades later, a goodbye so brief and so sincere that it said more than any lengthy tribute ever could. If you asked Parker Stevenson today whether he has moved on, by most indications the honest answer would be yes. He has his marriage, his passion for photography, which he has described as one of the truest reflections of who he is, and his children and grandchildren, along with a quieter life that always seemed to suit him better than the spotlight ever did. But somewhere within all of that remains the permanent fact of Kirstie Alley, the woman who spotted him across a crowded room decades ago and decided without hesitation that he was worth crossing it for. She made 14 years of being complete opposites feel, for a long stretch of time, like the best possible reason to keep showing up. She is gone now. The rescued animals, the elaborate treasure hunts, the way she could light up any room simply by walking into it, all of it now belongs to the past. But her grandchildren are here, carrying pieces of that story forward without ever having lived through it themselves. And a 74-year-old man who never once needed to be the same